which item, Tanner, inflation has just run away on?
Obviously, the biggest announcement this last week was GPT-4. And then we started getting down into the conversations of this next topic, Gary, which is dental therapists.
Welcome to another episode of Dental Rift. I am your co-host, Gary Bird, and I am the CEO of SMC National, where we provide predictable new patient growth for offices just like yours. And Tanner's laughing at me because I had to look at the name of the podcast that I was on today. So go ahead, Tanner.
Oh, man. Tanner Applegate, CEO and founder of Unified Dental. We are a tech company that provides password management for dental offices.
So we got 4 topics today. So we got number 1, we got inflation. Inflation is hitting home, what things are inflating, and there's actually some things that are actually going down in cost. We also have GPT-4. It's more human-like, and it's able to do a lot of things that the other versions weren't able to do. Also, Tanner went to the dentist recently, and it was owned by a hygienist, and he had some interesting terminology that I've never heard about before, and we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about banks failing. There's a lot of banks failing right now. There's been several, actually, and it looks like there's going to be possibly more, but I want to look back in the history of all the banks failing and how many have actually failed over the last 23 years. So, hey, sorry to disrupt the show, but I just have a quick commercial for you. We are going to be hosting 4 events over the next 12 months, and we're doing a little bit of everything for everybody. We have something around Full Arch. We have something for those that manage marketing. We have something for those that want to scale their practice at Dykema. And then also we have something next year that's for everybody in your practice to learn business skills and to really maximize the opportunities for you to grow your offices. You're not going to want to miss these. Visit smcnational.com/events. These are going to be the premier events that you're going to want to go to make sure that you're getting the tactical skills that you need to continue to grow the way that you want, because at SMC, we're all about growing. Let's jump into inflation first. Guess which item, Tanner, is absolutely inflation has just run away on?
Oh, man, don't throw that on me. I'm going to look even dumb when I'm completely far off.
It's a food. I'll give you this. It's a food.
It used to be like cheese. I remember cheese went up crazy, but I'm going to say milk.
Close. It's eggs.
Eggs. Oh,
eggs
yeah,
are up
true,
almost 56%. Eggs are up almost 56%. And then nothing's even close to that. Nothing has increased that much. And so then from there, it's butter and margarine. So you were right in that right family. But that's only 27%. Airfare is up 27%. Fats and oils. And what's happening right now with the Fed too, because the Fed moved $1 trillion off of their deficit, which was good, but then they just added $300 billion back on because of the bank bailouts. And so there's a possibility where if they're going to be printing more money and the interest rates, they're going to announce in the next day or so, what I think this week sometime, where they're going to raise rates. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. Does that cause more inflation, or does it slow down inflation? I've heard that banks failing is a deflationary thing. Nonetheless, this is where we currently sit with inflation. So you can see here the food items, that really hits home because that impacts every single business, right? Because it doesn't matter what you do. All of our clients are dentists, so all of their patients, this hits home for them. I mean, this is hitting them right from their bottom line. And motor vehicle insurance has gone up 15%, which doesn't even really make sense to me unless it's maybe just a labor increase that they're covering. Gas has gone up. That makes sense. Electricity's up big time. Motor vehicle repairs have gone up, and used cars. Now, the reason used cars dropped, remember there for a while, they shot up. They were like doubling in price there for a while, where you couldn't even get your hands on a used car. So that makes sense why that has dipped back down.
Same with major appliances, same thing.
So my question, Tanner, is how do you see this kind of playing out in the economy?
Inflationary data in general or specific to dentistry?
Yeah, how do you think this is going to hit dental offices?
My biggest concern is that because of impacts in what's been happening with like the banking and stuff, is that the feds end up getting too complacent and they end up saying, okay, we're going to ease off of raising interest rates, et cetera, because of all these things that have been happening. but it actually wasn't a direct correlation to what was happening with inflation, and inflation continues to still run rampant and we're not getting it under control, right? So I think that there is this high demand of like, hey, let's make sure we're reining in these interest rates and not continuing to raise them because it's impacting all of these other industries negatively, but at the same time, not doing so will also have a huge macro impact on the economy.
So what I hear you saying is either you're going to wreck the big banks, the bigger entities by continuing to increase interest rates, but that will slow down inflation, which will help the little guy, it will help the Main Street, the everyday consumer, or you can help the banks by slowing down, by slowing down the raise of interest rates, but that's going to cause inflation to continue to run, which is going to help banks but really hurt the consumer. Does that sound about right?
I don't think it has a direct correlation with the banks in general, right? Because the banks they make their money from a lot of different things, right? One of them is, hey, I'm going to loan it out to you at an interest rate, and now all of a sudden when you pay me back, great, I'm going to make money off of it. Well, when interest rates are high, it's not like they're taking a bigger cut of it, right? They're still only doing the same markup as they did before, but what happens is that the amount of people getting money out is lower, right? So banks on the inflationary data, I don't know exactly how it's going to make a huge impact on them. One of the things, though, that I did appreciate as I was kind of reading up on this bank collapse is that the government is not actually putting it back on the taxpayers to bail out these banks that are failing, right? So they're actually putting it back on these bigger banks to say, hey, by the way, if this bank collapses, it could trigger this bank to collapse and this bank to collapse. And all of a sudden now we're at a banking crisis in general across our economy, and your business loses a lot of its value because people lose trust in the banking system. And so what instead that they've done, the FDIC, is they say, hey, there's this 10 billion, half of it's already been covered because you guys have been paying into this FDIC bucket every month. But in order to cover out the remainder of this, you guys have to pay into it in order to make sure these banks don't collapse and that the entire banking system doesn't collapse as well. So it's actually ironically being paid for by the Chases and by the giant banks in the system are the ones that are bailing out the people that had these money in these banks that are collapsing. So I appreciated that. I appreciated that it didn't come directly out of our pocket. And then the smart thing, which I had never heard before, and I guess I'm not an economist expert, was that they did it in a way in which the banks will get paid back, but over a period of time. So it was essentially kind of loan in this money and then you'll make it back. I'm just curious kind of to learn a little bit more about that, but wasn't able to.
Yeah, I've been trying to read up on it too. My understanding is that the reason that a lot of these banks are in trouble is because they invested in long-term bonds that in a 0% interest rate environment that they were getting like 1.5 2 points. And it was good for the time, but then when interest rates raised, it was actually turned out to be a really bad investment. And this is like a byproduct of them holding on to these investments when people are trying to pull their money out to put into other places, because you don't want your money in the bank when you can put it somewhere else for 5, 6, 7%. And this is what's causing a lot of those issues. So slowing down the interest rate may give them a little bit of relief there, but it's not, to your point, I don't think it's going to necessarily solve the problem.
Really, the main priority in all this is managing public perception of it, because SVB was unique in the fact that hey, we got billions of dollars from these VC firms that were going crazy a couple of years ago. Once now all of a sudden their money's in here, we invested them into these assets, right? The bonds that you were saying. And now those bonds aren't going to be able, people are pulling money out because the VC world and the startup world isn't doing as hot. And so now all of a sudden they need their money. We have it in these bonds. We have to sell off these bonds in order to give them their money. And by selling off these bonds, we're actually losing some money because the value of them has gone down, right? And so what the government has actually done in order to help fix that going forward is they said, okay, any small bank that has assets in these long-term bonds and you need to sell, instead of actually selling them, the government will now give you a loan for what you would have sold, right? So you still own the bonds, they give you a loan, you have to pay those loans out as your bonds come to completion, right? 10-year term or however long their term was. Yeah. And so that's how they kind of addressed it and handled it, was to say, don't sell them. Because really the biggest issue was, I heard about this the other day, and I hadn't heard about this, was initially because you have to make a public statement of why you're raising money as a publicly traded company that you are raising. So their statement was don't panic. And as soon as somebody says don't panic, you're oh, well, maybe I do need to panic. And that was exactly what the whole issue was. So
Yeah.
it was something that, like, honestly, if they would have handled it differently in the public perception, I think that they'd still be around. They handled their PR terribly, and now all of a sudden we're in the situation that we're in. But I do think that the regulations that have been put into place as a result of this are actually necessary and important.
Yeah, it's like every time we go through one of these crises, we learn something, right? So during the Great Depression, they put in a bunch of triggers to not allow that to happen to the stock market again, because it was just like a panic sell-off. So it's just like, hey, if there's a panic sell-off, let's freeze the market, and they have that built in now automatically. Right. And then in the housing crisis, they put in some rules around loaning money on huge balloons and things like that. And thankfully, that's been covered. So they've kind of covered our tracks there. This is a little bit different of a scenario, and they're going to put in rules and things around that. I think the next big thing is going to be like the personal like debt around like auto loans and things like that. They're going to have to put in some kind of trigger around that as well, because that's just ballooning and going crazy right now as well. But we'll see. You want to talk about the next one, your ChatGPT 4?
Yeah. So last week, big launch, right? I don't know. Did you see the demo of Google? Google did the demo of their new AI. It was interesting enough for me to keep Google on the list to pay attention to in the AI space. So they're going to roll it out first to like Google Docs and presentations, etc. And so that was exciting. But then obviously the biggest announcement this last week was GPT-4. So the biggest, just kind of for listeners that don't pay attention to it, that aren't as big of nerds as I guess Gary and I are, right? Some of the bigger differences is that this is a lot more complex model, right? So it can process a lot more data, it can give you a lot more outcome, et cetera. And so it's a lot more creative in its responses. But the biggest one too is that it's multi-variable. So you can actually use things like typing, like you can with the old ChatGPT, but you can also input images and all these other things of ways in order to be able to say, hey, take this image and then process me this, right? So that was fascinating. I'm curious, have you gotten access to it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have it. Yeah, the consciousness level is doubled on it, which is very, very interesting, and the reasoning has gone up as well. So it's a lot slower. So it processes the information slower. I think that probably they did that because of bandwidth issues, because they have had bandwidth issues. So they just slowed it. They said, yeah, we'll give you this new feature, but it's going to be a little bit slower. But it is much more powerful. It's really good. Like it's much better for creating copy and knowing exactly what I want. And it seems to do a better job remembering of who I am and what I'm interested in. So it keeps it in that family as I'm doing different projects in it as well. The other thing that I've been playing with it on is I'm actually working with my daughter. She is 13 years old. I'm using it as a tutor for her. So I'm actually going through and learning how to use it for tutoring, because the play, I actually watched a video on this. They said, imagine using ChatGPT as a tutor, because it's infinitely patient and you can ask all kinds of questions in different ways, and it can help you really understand why the problem's being solved that way. So I'm actually playing around with that as an actual tutor on math.
Awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. I'm super excited to be able to play around with like the imaging in prompt, because a lot of the times I think that when I brainstorm things, it's easier to brainstorm an idea of what I want and then tell it to actually like output it and stuff.
Yeah. Are you, because you have to have an API to do that. Do you have that?
I haven't gotten the API yet. I'm still waiting on my API to go through.
Yeah. I haven't applied for it, so I'm not using it for that, but I have found a bunch of AI prompts that are already built that people use, and that saves a ton of time, where it's just like, cool, keyword strategy, and you just hit one button and you put it in what you do, and it just cranks out tons of information on it. So that's been really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so you went to the dentist, and there's a hygienist that owns it. Now, I've heard of hygienists owning dental offices before, but it's very rare. But then you said dental therapist.
Yeah, so let's talk about this for a little bit, right? So to rewind, in certain states, it's legal for a hygienist to own I don't even know if you'd call them a dental office. They're probably more like hygiene offices, because they don't actually have an acting dentist in there, right? You can have rotating dentists come in and whatever, and you could probably actually have a full-time dentist in there, but they're really focused around the hygienist. And so I went into an actual dental office with a dentist in there, and the hygienist was temping in this office, but he actually owned his own hygiene office. So I was curious, kind of like, what do the economies of it look like, and kind of like, are you able to pay yourself more through your own business than you are being able to pay yourself through these, like if you were a hygienist in a normal dental office? And he said, like, obviously we didn't get into like P&Ls and everything, but he said, yeah, he's able to cover a lot of his bare minimum costs. And just like with every business, though, it ebbs and flows of like, okay, what's my patient flow look like this month versus last? And so I was fascinated by that. It's the first time I'd actually heard somebody doing that. I've heard of someone being able to do it, but first time connecting with someone that has done it. And then we started getting down into the conversations of this next topic, Gary, which is dental therapists, right? So when I initially said it, Gary, what kind of went through your mind? You kind of laughed when I said the concept. What were you thinking a dental therapist was?
Oh, I thought for sure it was somebody who was like talking like distressed entrepreneur dentist off the ledge from too much debt from school and opening up their practices or something like that. That's and I'm just like, wow, who's doing that? And how does that work? And then you started to explain it. So
I think that's, I like the idea of that concept. I think it's probably actually very well needed, because there's probably plenty of dentists out there that need a dentist specific therapist for all the pain that you go through. But no, so a dental therapist is a mid-level provider, right? So you've got the hygienist who can do a certain amount of skills, and then the dentist, and now a dental therapist is coming in where they can do more than a hygienist, but not the same as a dentist, right? There are a handful of states that already have this in play, like Washington, Alaska, Wyoming, right? It's usually where access to care is really a issue. But it was fascinating to kind of hear Colorado had recently passed it this last year. And so talking through that was fun to be able to say, okay, a dental therapist can do this. So put together a dental hygienist being able to own an office and a dental therapist and their expanded capabilities, it brought to me a lot of ideas of like, okay, is this going to impact the industry? I could see where it'll impact it positively, but I could also see where it impacted negatively. So Gary, as you kind of hear about this concept and idea for the first time, where does your mind go? What do you start thinking about with this?
Opportunities, like just a new vertical and really giving the patients what they want. So I actually recently talked to a dentist, and this is not in that same family, but it's close to it. So he was talking to us about helping him with his marketing, and he's like, yeah, I see about 400 new patients a month. And I said, man, that's a lot. How much are you guys doing? Because yeah, we're doing about $500,000 a month. And I'm like, that's a big practice, one practice. He said, every morning I show up to my practice and I have 40 patients standing at my door. And I said, okay, that's different. Like that's not, there's
right.
Not a lot of that going on, right? Like that's different. What are you doing? He goes, basically we just position ourselves as the emergency dentist, and we always make time to have same day treatment. Like we always try to get people in, and we have to turn people away. And I have an endless list of people who are reaching out to me every single day that I need to get this work done. And he's in Missouri as well, which he accepts all insurances for real, not pretend like and get sued. But he accepts all insurances, and he said Medicaid pays really well here, better than, and he listed a bunch of insurances that Medicaid paid better payouts on. And then I was just like, man, this is so cool that, because I've talked to other people who've built practices that do $500,000 a month, and they're doing it like through sedation, or they do it through implants, and they have GP underneath it. And those are big. That's a big practice. The biggest I've ever seen is over $1 million a month at one practice. But he was doing it a completely different way. I think this is another way to serve the patient. And actually what he's doing is he's serving a segment and giving them exactly what they want. I think there's a segment or market that you could possibly serve and give them exactly what they want in this scenario.
What do you think that looks like? What does the patient want that they're not able to get in a different model?
It's not a matter of, well, okay, so like the emergency place is like getting the same day thing. Right. So I would say like same day cleanings, getting your cleanings done right away, whitening, those kind of things, like just done right away. Like so come in, schedule same.
As a business, though, you have to position yourself in order to be able to really capitalize on that, right? So his model was still the same as like an old dental office, where it's in a retail-ish location, but not like a walking street, not something that you would accidentally like stop in by. It's something that like, oh, I have to think about it beforehand in order to go. Their hours were not open very long, etc. And so that would be problematic for that one, right? So then what are the other things that a patient can't get that this would solve?
Well, I'll present it in a different way to you. So this is how I would do it. I would go partner with somebody like a Walmart or a Walgreens or something like that, where people have to go and get groceries and people are waiting, and there's a waiting game involved. And then I would say, oh, by the way, while you're waiting, you can get your teeth cleaned, you can get your teeth whitened, and have it there. So that way it's serving them as they're waiting in the process. That's how I would set something like that up. If you said, where would the opportunity fall?
Okay. One of the ways that I consider this to have an effect is, this is obviously a great model for mobile clinics, right? Mobile clinics, if you can reduce the headcount to say, okay, hygienists, you can essentially own your own mobile clinics and visit all these dentists visit all these locations and be able to do cleanings and or some restorative work as a mid-level provider. Now the opportunity for you as a hygienist, which will now become a dental therapist, you will be able to make a lot more money and actually have it financially start making sense from this mobile model, right? The other one too is, as a dentist that owned a practice, I consider this model of like, okay, there's a lot of entrepreneurial hygienists that aren't able to execute on their entrepreneurialism, right? Like if you go in and you look at it, there's a lot of hygienists that do things outside of being a hygienist, things like consulting. They even get a lot of the times in the administrative stuff because they don't want to get capped out at what they're earning.
Yep.
So now all of a sudden there's this model of like, hey, you know what? I'm a dentist. You are wanting to be an entrepreneurial hygienist. Why don't I give you equity into this practice and you go out and start seeing a lot of patients and referring any additional work back to me. Right now you're being able to get a lot more of the higher value cases. They can actually diagnose a lot of that stuff as a dental therapist. And so now you're really kind of fine tuning the amount of production per hour you're getting as a doctor, because you're not doing things like consults, you're not doing things like exam checks, etc.
And everybody's going to say yes. Yeah, and the therapist is just, everything's just yes, it's already ready to go. They've already agreed to everything, so it makes your life a lot easier.
Yep.
So it's kind of almost going back to the traditional dental model where everything's referred out and all the people around the GP office just have plenty of work to do. That's kind of started to dry up because of the super GP offices that kind of do everything under one roof. So this would be kind of going back into that model, but starting lower on the food chain, so to speak, where you're starting at the entry level of like, what do patients actually want? They want to get their teeth cleaned. They've been trained to do that, right? Like, what do people want with their cars? They want to get an oil change, right? Like that's at the base of it. That's like the main thing we know everybody knows that they have to do. And then taking that opportunity and flipping it upstream. I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah. One of the things too is like I recently had hand surgery on my hand because I ended up cutting a tendon and had to get that tendon repaired. And I got it done at a hospital, but the the orthopedic surgeon, he actually practiced at a location that was like 50 minutes away. So because he was the one on call at the time of the ER visit that I did, I ended up getting assigned to him and had to drive 50 minutes every time I met with him. Well, with the initial consult, like that was fine because I was like, okay, I got to go meet him and it's fine. But then I had a bunch of like PT appointments that were 50 minutes away. And my value of my time for this PT appointment, like mentally, was a lot less. Right. So take that model and apply it to the dental office. Getting a cleaning to me is not very valuable. I don't want to go and drive 45 minutes to go see a hygienist when I know there's a million along the way. So if I can shortcut that as a doctor and say, hey, let me get you extra convenience by having this hygienist almost come to you. Now all of a sudden when I have work to do, oh sure, I'll drive an hour because I have to get this root canal done. Whereas I wouldn't have driven an hour to get a hygienist.
That's a great point. Yeah, it's very interesting. I think that's going to be, what state did you say this is in that you're allowed to do these kind of things?
Dental therapists exists already in Washington, Alaska. I think it's Wyoming. Don't quote me on that. But it also just passed for Colorado. So I'd be interested if any DSO model out there for Washington or Colorado interested in this. Love to talk to you more about it. Maybe even bring you on.
Awesome. Okay, I would love to talk to somebody about that. Last topic. Let's talk about bank failures really quickly. So in the year 2000, there was 2 bank failures. In the year 2001, there was 4 bank failures. In 2002, there was 11. 2003, there was 3. 2004, there was 4. Then we went several years with no bank failures. And then in the 2008, from 2008 to about 2013. Looks like there was 1, 2, 3, 4, about 500 bank failures during that time, which is a lot. 500 bank failures.
All American
is a ton. I think this is all American. Yeah. How many? I think this is all in America. And then it kind of trickled down from there. In 2015, it went to 8, 5, 8, 0 in 2018. 2019, 4 went down. 2020, 4 went down. Then we had 0 in 2001, 0 in 2002, and then in 2003, it says 2 on here, but I think we're officially at 3, I think, now, since the last time we spoke. So I just thought it was interesting that pretty much bank failures have been happening for the last 23 years. There's been a ton of them over the last 23 years. It's been a total of 565 bank failures over the last 23 years, 25 per year on average. And there's only been a couple years where we didn't have any. Does that kind of change your perspective on things a little bit? It did for me. I was like, oh, I guess bank failures. Now, I'll flip the other side. I was talking to a financial person, and they've been in the financial industry for years, and they said, look, I think just like COVID, where all the money consolidates to the big companies, right? So what happened during COVID? The rich got richer and stronger, right? And the smaller, weaker businesses kind of fizzled out. And we saw this in Amazon and all these bigger companies, right? Well, and with banks, he's predicting the same thing's going to happen, where the bigger banks, because to your point earlier that you said they're covering kind of the losses of these smaller banks, they will gobble up a lot of the banks, and then we'll have less and less bank options in the future. Also, smaller banks are not regulated the same way. And then this is going to give an opportunity for the Fed to come out with some kind of digital currency, which is going to give them much more control over it. So I thought that was an interesting take as well, which I could definitely see a world where something like that happens.
Yeah, I think that in my mind, that's a little bit of a stretch based off of kind of like the way that I remember being taught this in middle school, and I don't know why it stuck with me so much, but the whole idea of like a paradigm, right? Like, where do we view as like acceptable and not acceptable today will shift and become different in like a year or two from now. And I think that where our paradigm is, I'm not saying that we would never get there, but I think it's a long stretch from where we are to getting to that idea of like this digital currency, which really our currency is digital, right? It's not backed by any gold or anything like that. So but it is still regulated. I think, did you mean by digital currency, do you mean like decentralized or kind of deregulated currency?
No, I don't think the Fed would ever want to go into a decentralized. I mean, Bitcoin's going up like crazy. So right now, because of the bank failures, it's exactly correlated with banks are failing. People are putting their money in Bitcoin because it has a limited number. There's only going to be 21 million Bitcoins ever. That's never going to inflate. But I don't think the Fed will want to go through something like Bitcoin. They will create their own coin that they can instantly add a zero at the end of anytime they want. They can also control it much closer. So one of the problems that the Fed runs into is like when they want you to spend your money, they have to go through a lot of process to get the money out of your bank account and get you to spend it by passing legislation, things like that. If we had a digital currency as an example, all they'd have to do is say, all right, everybody who has money in a bank account over 100,000, you have a negative interest rate. Well, what would you do? You would instantly go out and invest it, put it in other places. And so it would just give the Fed more control over the money supply and how it's moving based on interest rates and negative interest rates.
Yeah, I think that thinking through like the logistics of that technically, because you obviously have to reduce any kind of fraud or any issues like that, and so to be able to keep track of it enough where we're closing off a lot of those gates, like that just seems like a huge undertaking that I don't personally, I guess, see enough of the benefit behind it. But it's always still fascinating to me to think of kind of what is the difference of a world could look like versus where we are.
Yeah,
it seems a little
100%.
bit of a stretch for me.
Yep. Well, we'll see. We'll find out soon. When I think over the next couple of weeks, we're going to see as people are starting to listen to this. When this episode drops, I think we're going to see where things are going to fall and what's going to happen and how big this is going to be or small it's going to be. So it's going to be interesting. I feel bad for people who have fixed incomes, and this inflation is just like out of control. It's just irresponsible management of money and printing of money, and it causes this massive inflation, and it really hurts people on fixed incomes. And that's who I sit and look at and go, man, how do you navigate that? How do you, when all of your expenses go up by 20-30%, and you have a fixed income, what do you do? And those are the people that are hurt the most by this.
Yep, for sure. That's when you start getting overemployed. Let's talk about that next week. You heard about the whole trend of overemployed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, I have. I've had people try to take advantage of that situation.
Let's chat about that again. All right. Okay, man. Well, it's good chatting with you. We'll talk to you soon.